Hello again, seniors. This is 5 things about the D-Day prayer in 5 minutes. First off, some context on this speech. The speech was given in 1944, near the end of World War II. Now, the biggest problem in getting to the end of the war, at least the war happening in Europe, was being able to get into Europe itself, and therefore get into Germany. Germany had conquered most of Europe by this time, so it was really a struggle for them to actually get on land and fight their way to Berlin. So what the Allied forces decided to do was have this mass invasion strategy where the United States and Britain and any other Allied forces, but mainly those two, would land on the beaches of Normandy in France from the air, by boat, just this mass invasion, and kind of just force their way in. Now, this was an extremely dangerous invasion and ended up a lot of people dying. If you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, that gives us probably the most realistic take on what this invasion would have been like. Just people dying everywhere, a lot of horrific stuff. However, it was the thing that allowed us to get into Europe and end this war. The United States and Great Britain came from one side in France, and we had Russia coming from the other side and meeting in Berlin to finally stop Hitler there in Germany. So the invasion was kept top secret for obvious reasons, but as it was happening, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States at the time, gave this speech that's entitled the D-Day Prayer. So why a prayer? There's a few reasons why President Roosevelt would have chosen a prayer. One being that the United States during that time period was a little different than it is today, a lot more religious people. And on top of that, when it comes to war, people tend to get more religious. They tend to be looking for something else. And that was definitely true in World War II. We also saw this after 9/11. When horrific things bring our country together, and we see even government leaders saying prayers in important places, like on the steps of the Capitol building. So this would have been something like that. We also see that President Roosevelt is being persuasive here. This is the very last step of the war. They need to get into Europe so that they can bring this horrific war to an end. And what he needs is the support of the country behind him, all of us together, in order to make that happen. There was a lot of American soldiers being sent over there. A lot of them would end up being killed. That's their sons, their brothers, their fathers. And so in order to bring about that support, he uses what we call pathos, or an appeal to our emotion, in order to make us believe that we are on the right side of this conflict, on God's side, if you will. As I mentioned, this speech is very much a persuasive one, and so one of the techniques that persuasive speakers will use is at the very end of the speech, they give a call to action. That's the reason they're giving a speech. They want you to do something, and certainly President Roosevelt wanted the people to do something. We see in line 2, I ask you to join me in prayer. He wants them to join with him, and not just in prayer, but in this cause. We see also in paragraph 10, President Roosevelt asks the American people to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith. Like I said, this is the very end of the war. A lot of people are just sick of war, and he needs the American people to be on his side at this last leg of it. So he needs that renewed faith, that renewed sense that, again, this is the right thing to do. One thing to look for in all persuasive speeches, and you can even do this, it's election year, you could even do this as we listen to speeches from our candidates, but there are 3 appeals that persuasive speakers will use to convince you to do something or to get their point across. The first is called pathos. I've already talked about it. It's an appeal to our emotion. Right? Anything that's going to try and make us feel that pride, that patriotism in our country, or anything that's going to make us feel sad by something terrible that's happened. Politicians, especially, and persuasive speakers in general, will use this to grab our attention and to get us to do something. The second one is called ethos. This is an appeal to credibility. So oftentimes persuasive speakers will give us the name of someone famous or an expert in their field and use those people to back them up. That lends credibility to their argument. The last appeal is called logos, and I think that's the easiest one to remember because logos mean logic. And so this is an appeal to our logical sense. If something makes sense because of statistics or because of a scientific fact, if a persuasive speaker uses that, we know they're appealing to our logical sense. The last thing that I'll talk about is word choice. Again, it's very important when you're giving a persuasive speech or when you're doing persuasive writing to use specific words that are going to succeed in these appeals that I've been talking about, an appeal to our emotions. In this speech, we see words like righteousness, faith, crusade, sons. A lot of these words are religious. They have religious connotations. And again, this is an emotional appeal. Suddenly, if we are doing what is quote unquote righteous, that means we're on the side of God. It means we're on the side, we're doing the right thing. And so this was a very conscious effort by President Roosevelt to get the American people on his side, and it worked. So that's all I have for you. I hope that helps you to answer the questions. Next week, we'll be starting on our extended writing project. It will be an argumentative essay, and please stay tuned for that. Be watching Google Classroom. Please make sure that you're participating so that you can get an A for the class and not an incomplete. All right, guys, we'll see you next week.